Hey, PreSales Collective, it's your host, James Kaikis, and today I'm joined by Marjorie Abdelkrime, Senior Director, Cloud Solutions Engineering at VMware. You may have seen Marjorie's name floating around the PreSales Collective as she's been involved since the beginning. She was on one of our first webinars and actually has been a host for 2 PreSales Collective webinars. Today's episode is titled Leading Transformational Projects. I don't know about you, but I feel like the pre-sale role tends to be project management heavy. And how many times have we actually been trained on how to effectively project manage? It's a very interesting part of our role and an interesting part of our reality. And so many times we're asked to lead a big enablement project or some sort of transformational project within the organization and are given the keys, but not necessarily learning how to do that. And so in today's episode, we're going to learn how Marjorie handles large-scale transformational change, how she's run projects in the past, and she gives a lot of insights and learning in today's episode. Enjoy. Hey, Marjorie, how are you?
Good. How are you, James? Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. It's been a little bit, but glad we're talking again. So thanks for your time.
Yeah, no, as always, love talking to you guys and love all the work that you all are doing.
How are things?
Things are really good. Exciting news here. I'm promoting one of our SEs into a leadership role. So that's always a ton of fun to see someone grow and progress in their career. And that also means some work off of my plate, which is even more exciting.
Best of both worlds, right?
Yes.
I like to hear the promotion from within as well. You know, it's always good to have those kind of success stories within an organization. So I got to ask though, before we get into today's topic, VMware is doing a Women and Allies in Sales event. Is that correct?
Yeah. So it's our very first event that we're doing at VMworld, which is our marquee customer event that we do annually. We were hoping to do it in person, but with the times that we're in, we're doing a virtual event. We have about an hour and a half of time scheduled for our female customers to join us on a session called The Inspired Future. It's going to be lined with some great speakers as well as customers that are going to talk a little bit about their career progression, so we can all hear about how people move forward in their own organizations and, just share stories and discussions. So it should be a ton of fun. And maybe we'll have a DJ too, by the way.
I like it. The new virtual world. I'd love to hear that and really looking forward to hearing the feedback from that event as well and the successes. So we're rooting for a great event for you guys. Before we get into today's topic of leading transformational projects, Marjorie, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into pre-sales?
Wow. So I started off actually in tech support, but then eventually moved into services. And I spent actually the first about 8 years of my vendor side of my career in professional services. And the organization that I was a part of at the time was going through some strategy changes, and our organization shifted priorities and was doing a lot more with our partners. So services was somewhat diminished in terms of scope within the company. So I was actually placed into a sales role, and I like to share the story that I went kicking and screaming. I was actually very unhappy that I was being put into the sales organization. I had one of the services leaders at the time. We were actually walking through our cafeteria in Mountain View, and he's like, Marjorie, just recognize this is going to be the best thing that happens to you in your career. And I looked at him, I'm like, you don't know what you're talking about. But, now as I reflect back on it, I really do think it's been one of the best things that has happened to me. I love being in the sales organization. It's a different engagement with the customer, and it's a ton of fun.
I'm really glad to hear you say that because we just released a podcast called Post-Sale to Pre-Sale and talking about that experience. So let me ask you this question on your experiences. Do you think working in post-sale and working on the other side of the house has made you better at sales generally?
Yeah, because you tend to realize some of the challenges that customers face when they've bought the product, right? So now they need to realize the value of what you've sold them. It really makes you reflect about how you're having conversations about the solution that you're positioning to your customer, really thinking about outcomes in a different way. And actually, a lot of the training that you'll see a lot of SEs going through in their career nowadays is about the consultative sale and the outcome-based sale, right? So you're starting to see that evolution happening naturally within the industry.
I love that perspective because I think it's the truth. Some of the best pre-sales consultants that I've met have come from post-sale because you understand that reality. And this is not a podcast about post-sale, but I like to definitely talk about it and hear your experience. Can we just lightly talk about your experience at VMware?
So I came into VMware I had actually taken a brief break from being in sales and decided to go back into services to lead an organization for post-sales. And I got to a point where I was just ready to go back into sales. It was just time, right? Folks that are in services will share with you some of the pains that we go through. And I called the leader that I used to work with and I said, hey, I'm ready to go back into sales. What do you think? What are you all doing these days? And he said, you know what? We're actually doing this new thing here. It's called this chief of staff role. And I took on this chief of staff role about 3 years ago. And it was basically helping lead strategy and transformation for the SE organization. But, I came in and I said, hey, I want this for about 2 years, but eventually I want to move into a field-facing role again, right? That's where my heart is with the customers. And here I am. I'm leading, again, a field-facing individuals and an organization that's helping our customers transform, how they're migrating to the cloud and their cloud journeys.
I love that journey. I love that experience too, because I'm sure doing that chief of staff role has changed your perspective on how you approach things in the field as well.
Absolutely. It makes you realize the importance of all of the operational teams that exist within a company. I think a lot of times we don't appreciate sales ops because we don't recognize the level of effort that they put towards making our business process oriented and consistent and repeatable, which makes it easier for us. Definitely, you gain a different level of appreciation for that.
So let's talk about more of that transformational aspect of things. Today's topic, leading transformational projects. You are the perfect person to talk about this. So let me ask you first, when you say transformational projects, what do you mean by that?
When we talk about transformational, there's just so many different aspects and individuals and organizations that you're going to be going through. So I think as you're defining your initiative and as you're looking at the projects, one, it's an initiative that's going to drive meaningful change. And it's something that will be felt across the entire organization. And it's meant to impact multiple teams, right? And really change the way the organization functions on a day-to-day basis. It means you're evolving how individuals may be learning or processes that you're executing against, et cetera. And traditionally, a transformational project is something that tends to be top down. It can be a bottoms up initiative. I think, eventually we'll talk about the different types of initiatives and how to make them successful. But yeah, transformational initiatives tend to traditionally be top down.
Tell us about a transformational project that you've been a part of.
One that I like to talk about that's been extremely impactful, and I didn't come to realize the impact of it until after I changed roles. I'll talk about that first before I talk about the actual project. I had someone reach out to me not too long ago and said, hey, I'm looking at a chief of staff role, someone in the SE organization. And he's like, can you tell me about what it means to be a chief of staff? And I flipped it on him and I said, hey, what did I bring to you as an SE leader within the company? I was just curious to see what he would say, right? Kind of putting him on the spot. He talked about this project and he's like, you really helped drive the transformation of how we learn as an organization and how our SEs are focusing on enablement. So my team and I decided at the beginning of my career journey at VMware to really look at what the learning journey of the SE was, right? So if you think of VMware, we have a fairly large product portfolio and you cannot deliver the same training to everyone every time. Every person is at different levels. So we decided to take out kind of this one size fits all and really drive strategic product knowledge for the SEs based on their own journey where they were from a learning perspective. What we did was we developed a methodology to help define what training meant. We established tools and resources that helped us track where folks were in their learning journey. We also established a point system because always we want to make sure that what we're learning is what we're using and we're rewarding folks for it. And then really at the end of the day, the results were that the SE had a clear path to what their plan was. Now they feel like they have control over their learning journey a little bit more than they had before. And really now they understand the business impact of why they're getting specific training. It's not just throw over the fence. You need to learn this, standard training.
Can you maybe talk a little bit about the point system generally? Because I think a lot of companies struggle with this. They're like, hey, we need to do a bunch of enablement. We don't know how. And they tend to do a one size fits all instead of customize. And so that was when you were saying that, I was like, wow, that's actually really interesting. Can you maybe dive into that a little bit?
So one of the things that we looked at was how do we make training stick. And a lot of times, you send folks to a boot camp training or, a 5-day workshop, and they come back home to their home offices and their home teams, and they don't always necessarily use that knowledge. And then it goes away. They lose it because they're no longer using it. So post a massive training event, let's say a large 5-day training event, or let's say it's part of your learning journey, what we decided was for every activity that you do, you get a point. So for example, you've demoed the solution to another team, you get a point. You do a lunch and learn for a group of folks, you get more points, right? So depending on the type of activity would define the scale of the points that you were rewarded. And within certain groups, they were getting, new headphones, Bose headphones. And this was really to accelerate some of our emerging solution knowledge. But really, it was just to make sure that the training was coming across as something that they could use and that it was sticking again. And also that they were going out and giving back into the community of the SE organization.
That is fascinating to hear that you guys did that. Would you say that was probably one of the more successful projects that you've done in your career?
I would definitely say that's been a huge highlight for some initiatives. Again, for us, transforming how we learn is super important, especially for SEs. If you think about how much we have to learn so that we can keep current, we can't keep doing the same thing over and over again. And I do believe that this was something that was super impactful.
I think we could ask you to talk about this project for the entire podcast. I think it would value a lot of people, but we'll continue going. So I want to actually ask you a question around the how of this, right? You talked a little bit about traditionally this being a top-down initiative. So how do you go about driving these initiatives? Because I think a lot of people have great ideas, but understanding the how is what I continue to see as like the biggest challenge in organizations.
I would say that you need to first establish the RACI, right? So who is going to be responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed? And that really takes you through defining who needs to be involved in this initiative. Who are the key stakeholders? Who are going to be the people that are actually executing against the project? So having a very clearly defined RACI early on ensures that you're going to be successful. And I think also it helps eliminate some of the challenges that you find in larger organizations like VMware, where 5 different teams may be working on the same exact project. And now you're stepping all over each other. So this helps with the uncovering of who else might be working on it and how do we partner together. Having executive buy-in is another key component of success of a project, especially with something that's going to require massive transformation on how people do something on a day-to-day basis. Without the executive buy-in, they're not going to help you roll it downhill. They're not going to help you make sure that individuals are complying with anything new that you're putting out there. So that's extremely important. Communication is another one. I feel that we are in communication overload. So it's important that we are being effective in the communication. You need to be consistent and clear with the purposes of why you're communicating, as well as, making sure that you're talking about next steps and when people can actually expect things. And then, like I talked about when I mentioned the RACI piece, just knowing who needs to be a part of the project outside of your own organization. Something like an enablement initiative required for us to involve our education teams, our product teams, internally our sales ops organization. So it required a lot of folks to get involved.
How do you know when to pivot? Because one of the things that I'm learning from being in a bigger organization now is that everyone is working on the same stuff. How do you know when it's your project to continue and move forward on and when you should look to partner, which sometimes slows things down?
I think you have to realize when you're looking at a project, who is going to be the end recipient of the transformation, right? And that can help define which organization leads it. I've had initiatives where we were just not finding someone that was solving the problem. And we're just going to charge the way forward. And then as we're moving forward, a team will come in and say, hey, by the way, we're already working on that. So it's a matter of inventorying at that point. All right, so let's talk. What are you doing? Here's what I'm doing. What do I hand to you? What do I take? Right? It becomes this negotiation. And sometimes you lose complete control of the project. And that's okay. I think that's another thing, is that we become very territorial about projects. And we just need to recognize that all of us are in it to make people's lives easier. And we should partner. We should be willing to give control. And, at the end of the day, there will be other projects that you can tie your name to. There isn't a shortage of problems that we need to solve, right?
I really appreciate that insight, because I think that's what a lot of people are facing at larger companies, and understanding how and when to pivot. And I love that you said that Sometimes you just got to work together and move things forward. As you're driving the project and you're building consensus, you're actioning, when or how do you know that you have success?
I think you need to very early on define some of your KPIs or your key performance indicators, and those will help you establish whether or not you've progressed your initiative in the right direction. I think the other one is, the story that I shared earlier about the chief of staff is just understanding your customer, right? So we're transforming, there's someone that we're transforming it for, and just having that dialogue with those folks. Hey, how did this impact you? And what could we have done differently? What could we have done faster? So again, getting feedback from folks, I think is super important. We tend to forget that part.
How do you think we should take the idea of like transformational projects within organizations and apply that to customer engagements? Do you have a perspective there?
I would say that everything that I have done to drive transformational projects, I have done when I've managed projects for customers. It's the same exact thing. You need to define a RACI. Who's your executive? How are they going to help you cascade that forward? What are the key performance indicators that you need to make sure that you're driving towards? Who are you changing with? Listening sessions are extremely important to have that understanding of how you're transforming for those individuals. So 100%, step for step, it's exactly the same.
That to me is a big takeaway for people because I think we tend to look at things internally and externally very differently. Maybe it's a little bit because there's sometimes chaos when it comes to external engagements. But it's awesome to hear that you say that. That's really actionable. Speaking of actionable, you're talking about a lot of really good things here. So what other best practices could you recommend for people that are listening to this?
So as far as best practices, I would say define your outcome early on, know and try to understand what you're trying to actually accomplish. The big one, and this is one that I gotta say, I've learned this really late in life. It's this definition of what done means. Sometimes you're in a project that just never ends, right? And it's because you've already finished technically the project that you signed up for. Someone just increased the scope. But you need to define what done is so that you mentally can say, okay, I'm done and I've successfully completed this, but I'm carrying on because now we're adding something different. But define done. And I think the other piece is collaboration is key. I'm not one to drive for consensus, but I do want to make sure that I've got folks on board and that they are bought in. But if we're going to sit here and drive for consensus, we'll just never finish and the project will be never done.
I'm with you. And I actually want to ask you a couple of things that you just said there. So you said you don't always drive consensus. And I am with you on that because I think consensus sometimes will actually slow things down so much that you might never actually hit that done moment. So how do you balance that? How do you balance building momentum and getting collaboration and understanding when you need consensus and when you don't?
I don't know if you've ever seen, there's like this quadrant of a team, right? So you have a team player, a collaborator, adversary, or a person who will not necessarily help drive initiatives forward. And there's another one that's kind of the neutral party that really doesn't do anything plus or minus. I try to categorize as many folks in the team player. You're helping me drive the initiative forward with me. We will work together to make decisions as a team. If we don't come to agreement, you commit and move forward. And I think that's how most folks need to start their projects. And actually, I've done many sessions with teams where that's how I start off the conversation. Commitment means we may disagree, but we move forward together as a team. And that's about setting the stage early on so that you are very clear on the expectation on how you're planning on driving success for an initiative.
That was fantastic. I haven't seen that diagram, but I actually want to see that diagram. And I like that you say that, right? Because you're going to have disagreements. And I think healthy friction is a good thing. One of the things that you did just mention too, that I want to highlight is I always talk about the curse of knowledge, but it almost sounds like there's the curse of done. I just moved personally into a new home. I was like, hey, we're done. And they said, you're never done. And it just made me think about projects that I've been a part of in my career. So I really do like that you talked about done and maybe setting those milestones of like, okay, this is what milestone is to be done. And if there's going to be an extra iteration, this is what it is. And this is the timeline we might get to it at.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the other thing is that done doesn't mean that you disconnect and run away. Done means that you've accomplished the initial goal and there will always be evolution, right? Like I mentioned, there's never a shortage of problems that we need to solve for. And some of the initiatives that you might have launched that transformed now due to changing times need to evolve and need to change. So you just continue to evolve the initiatives there.
So we were talking about best practices and on the good, but I also want to talk about the bad. So is there a project specifically that was maybe going well, but ended up not really going according to plan? Maybe walk us through that type of experience if you've had it.
If anyone tells you that they haven't, they're lying. Yeah, I'd say many. I mentioned earlier that I learned late in life defining the done moment. And that's because of projects that I'm just like, why are we just not getting this off the ground? And it's because we didn't define our milestone closure points, right? We didn't say, here's what I think done is, and here's where we are evolving, and here's how we continue to move it forward. So definitely, I think that's one. And the other one that's caused failure is the stakeholders, not having buy-in from stakeholders that'll help you carry things forward has been a big issue. And it's always been something that, any initiative, that's the first thing I ask. Who's going to be the stakeholder? How are we going to make sure that we get their buy-in? And how do they make sure that we're driving the initiative forward?
That's great advice, because nothing's worse than spending so much time, energy, and effort on something and it goes nowhere. And you're supposed to have a meeting with somebody, and your boss and your boss's boss are aware of it, but it falls flat in all the work you put into it. So I really like that in establishing it early. As we talk about actionable advice, there are probably people listening to this podcast that want to be doing more. They want to be doing these types of initiatives, these bigger types of engagements, but maybe their organizations aren't necessarily set up for them or don't create a culture that allow this type of work to flourish. So how should they proceed in that situation?
I'd say for starters, bite off as much as you can chew, right? So recognize that sometimes some things are much bigger than what one person can solve for. So make sure that you're, taking on an initiative that you can actually complete. I think the other part is if there's something that you're looking to evolve, let's say you're, an SE and you're in a smaller company and you recognize that here are some new processes that we need to implement. I'm a big fan of ask for forgiveness versus asking for permission. So get your colleagues together, band together, put together the process jointly and start to roll something out and demonstrate to your leadership team that you're willing to make some changes on how you all are functioning and some transformational approaches to how you're managing the SC function. And then, like I mentioned, recognize when you're going to have to make something complete or when you're going to have to hand it over to an organization that actually should be doing it, right? Because sometimes we're doing jobs that other teams should be doing because we're trying to solve our own problems. Be willing to hand it over, but just ask for influence in that project, right? Say, hey, can I continue to be a part of it? I'd love to be consulted. I'd love to give my input, but recognize that sometimes other teams will want to take over something that you started.
Marjorie, this has been fantastic talking to you. I always love when podcasts are super actionable and insightful, and this has definitely hit all of these. So I want to say thank you.
No, thanks to you, James.
Before I let you go, I do have to ask you two questions. The first one is, what is your favorite thing about the pre-sales role?
I love the people aspect of it. You get to meet so many new people every single day, and they make the job a ton of fun.
And number two is, what advice do you have for people who maybe want to take this next step in transformational projects and don't really know where to start?
I would say maybe do some reading on some books. I've done a couple of reading on consulting books, and I actually don't remember the name of the book. But there's some reading on projects, on how to launch projects, and definitely take some time and learn on how to run a project. And like we talked about earlier, a project is a project is a project, right? Whether it be internal, external, or even at home. If you think about stuff that you're doing at home, it's the same concepts. You always need to make sure that your entire family's on board with your home initiatives. If you're going to rip out the bathroom, you need to make sure that you're planning for that. What are the contingencies around that? So I would say, consult some reading material, and then also look for support within your leadership organization to open some of those doors to let you drive some of those transformational projects if that's not your official role.
Very relatable to all of us for sure. All right, Marjorie, thanks again for your time today. Thanks for being on the PreSales Podcast, and talk to you soon. Good luck at the Women and Allies in Sales event.
Thank you.
All right, PreSales Collective. I love when I finish a podcast and have a full page of notes. It's really impactful for me and a good learning experience. And I always enjoy talking to Marjorie and hearing her perspective. I also like talking to people who come from post-sales and apply those learnings to pre-sales. Marjorie had a lot of really good things to say. I think everything that she answered was very impactful, and there was a takeaway in each component. Some of my favorites were RACI. I had actually never heard of this before, but RACI again stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consulting, and Informed. I think this is a great way to look at your project to understand who you should be involving and what type of role that they should have. And speaking of involvement, key executives and getting top-down agreement is critical. It's huge because you might spend so much time, energy, and effort into making some project move forward. But if you don't have top-down buy-in, it could all be for naught. So it's a really important part of project management. One of the things that really resonated with me when she said collaboration is key, but not consensus. I'm a big fan of healthy friction, and I understand that not everyone in the room is going to agree on a decision, but understanding that you might not have consensus, but moving forward and being in the same boat to action toward completion of that project is mission critical. And speaking of finishing a project, defining what is done. I love the real life examples. Is it your home? Is it a project you're working on in your home? What does done mean? Defining done and understanding what a first, second, or third iteration could look like, but defining done and actioning toward that. I think we all know in pre-sales, scope creep can be real, especially if you're a company that sells pilots or POCs. Also, just don't be afraid to pivot. Don't be afraid to action towards something and say, hey, you know what? This isn't working. We need to make the adjustment. It's an important part of getting to done. Okay, Pre-Sales Collective, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. As always, like, share, and please let me know if you have any feedback. Otherwise, I'll see you next week. Thank you.